Hey, what's up? I'm Josh. I want to thank Woo Audio for sending this out for review. They're not paying, asking, or otherwise influencing me to say anything good or bad about this amplifier. All thoughts and opinions are my own. This, to me, is actually a bucket list amplifier. This is an amplifier that I've wanted to review for so long, back all the way in generation 1. This is generation number 3. We skipped 2 generations, never got the chance to listen to those. Unfortunately, I wish I had. But we're going to start with Gen 3, and hopefully it's a good one. Now, regarding its sonic characteristics for its changes over the years, I can't really talk about that because I don't have any experience with that. But there are a couple things that I can talk about regarding what they have changed, most notably now having an inbuilt power supply when it used to be separate. Now, I think for this minimalistic approach that they're going for was obviously the right move, and basically all but the most hardcore audiophiles are probably happy with an integrated power supply. Now, admittedly, what put this on my list initially was the looks, but there are lots of hi-fi amplifiers that look really incredible. But then it was backed up with a bunch of anecdotal evidence from friends of mine saying that this thing sounded really good. So I wanted to check it out, and I'm glad that it's here for me to actually finally get my hands on it and get my ears on it. Now, at this price point, you will notice that amplifiers start to get built very well. They also start to look very cool and kind of bring a level of, like, I hate to use the word, but like kind of like hi-fi like build to the equation. A lot of times sub $1,000 amps are kind of all built in the same vein of quality. They have differing levels of quality, but they're all kind of grouped into the same category. And at this price point, this is where a lot of amplifiers, including this one, kind of start to break away, and they get built with either features or components that are just a little bit ahead of those of the previous price category. So for example, it comes with this heavy duty, very solid, not acrylic, definitely glass kind of top that kind of comes off, and you will want to wear gloves because it does pick up fingerprints if you're going to move it a lot. And even things like the machining of the glass, how it's slightly chamfered, how everything is just polished. The quality of the glass doesn't look warped or wobbled at all. It's extremely high quality through and through. You can tell. There are other small things that cheaper amplifiers a lot of the times don't have. For example, on the potentiometer on this thing, there's this very thin line all the way around the perimeter of the volume knob. Now, as you spin this, you notice that this is exactly centered. It does not deviate from that gap at all. In the car world, this would be known as like a panel gap. And inconsistent or wide panel gaps are considered a bad thing. What you want is a very even, very tight line around. And it's small things like that on this amplifier that show you how well it was put together by the manufacturer. Now, I always get held up around things like this because on one hand, they feel like part of a reason to buy it. On the other hand, they feel like not part of the reason to buy it in a certain capacity. But I do think that things like this are something that potential owners appreciate. And so I do want to call it out when it's really good, like it is on this amplifier. So for example, even though this is only about a 5 by 5 by 5 inch cube, this thing is 9 pounds. This is heavy enough where you can plug in cables without having to touch it at all. You just plug it in, it doesn't move. It doesn't move when you unplug either. It's just super solid. And I personally like that a lot. On the back, this is pretty simple. You have a USB interface to the ESS Saber DAC. Now, notably, I could not find on the website or any other web page about which ESS DAC this is. I don't actually know, but it does have an ESS Saber DAC. I think some people won't care which DAC is in this, honestly, and I think some people will either love or hate the fact that it's ESS, even without listening to it. Personally, I think this thing sounds pretty great, but if you have opinions about that, that's up to you. Now, if you do have a problem with it and you don't want to run it, there are RCA analog inputs that you can use with this. Now, one of the very few features that this does have is a pre-out switch for the back. It has a 3.5 millimeter and a 4.4 millimeter balanced output. And the selection for that happens the back. And I'm not sure if you can see that light turning on and off, but that basically tells you headphone output versus pre-out output. And it is volume controlled. Now on the back, right above that pre-out switch, there is a input switch from RCA to USB. Since they did move these to the back, they basically handled them as well as I think they could, where they actually have the switches facing alternate directions. One is going up and down, the other is going left to right. Now, some people might prefer a more utilitarian style of this, where the switches are actually on the front, but this thing is so pretty without it that I'm actually totally okay with it being in the back. And because the switches are facing alternative directions, when you get used to the feel of it, reaching around to switch it, you kind of get used to which one is which. So I don't mind it too much, especially since there aren't too many options on this thing anyways. Now the tubes that this utilizes is the 12 AU7s. Regarding the power output of this, for the price, it's actually quite low. It's about 1.5 watts out of the 4.4 millimeter. I'm assuming that that measurement is taken at around 32 ohms most likely. One thing on the build here is that there are actually orange LEDs kind of shining through the bottom of the tubes. I want to make fun of this, but at the same time, it does look better. I have to admit, it does look better. They kind of play with it too, calling it the Fireflies, you know, because it got the lights and okay. So it kind of enhances the natural tube glow, which I think that most people will appreciate, because it kind of sucks when you get a tube amplifier in and in broad daylight, you don't even know the tubes are on. I think it's cool to actually see that the tubes are on, even if it's a little fake. So I want to talk about the sound of this, and the way that I want to talk about the sound of this is talking about various headphones and its potential with those headphones, because 1.5 watts is not going to sound like a lot, but in practice, this thing is making the absolute most out of that amount of power, and I would rather have this amplifier at weaker power than a 3 or 5 watt amplifier that doesn't sound as good personally. And I was actually quite surprised on what this could and couldn't drive, and I think you will be too. If you don't know, Woo sort of has a bromance going on with Abyss. They really like Abyss headphones. They sort of have this, I don't necessarily think it's a partnership, but it's definitely like a friendly, collaborative brand style. They seem to recommend each other's products. They seem to like each other's products, and they should. They both make great, very well built products. So I wanted to start with not the best headphone that they make, but my favorite headphone that Abyss makes, which is the Diana V2. A lot of modern amps with tons of power can run this headphone pretty well actually, but a lot of tube amplifiers in my experience cannot. I didn't like it on the TA22 despite liking that amplifier a lot. This doesn't even work at all on a dark voice. The bass just completely gets all weird and like flabby. So here you have a headphone that's difficult to drive, and most tube amplifiers don't do well with planar magnetic headphones. And yet this is one of my favorite pairings. This might be the amplifier that I like the most on this headphone. It drives it extremely well. I am rarely above about 2 o'clock on the volume dial, so there's still a lot of potential for volume output. But more importantly is how it handles the sound quality, specifically the vocals on this particular headphone, and the bass quality. Bass quality on this headphone with the right pairing can be an absolute pleasure and joy to listen to. And with the WA7, I really felt like the bass quality was exceedingly good with this headphone. I didn't feel like it had any compromises compared to a much stronger solid state amplifier like an A90D, for example. Another thing that I really wanted to test here was the quality and the tonality of the mid-range. And for that, I wanted to pick a very familiar headphone that a lot of us are used to, the HD600. And I wanted to cross-reference that with my findings with the V2, because I actually think that despite measuring quite weird, the V2 is actually one of the most pleasing vocal headphones that I have ever listened to, and that's one of the reasons why it's my favorite. For technicality, it's not quite up there with the 1266s, with the TCs of Abyss. It's not up there with a lot of the super high-end flagship headphones, but for mid-range, I do think that is one of the best in terms of my personal preference, maybe not on a graph. And this is where this amplifier really shines, is its mid-range tonality and capability. It is a wonderful sounding amplifier. So there's this thing that happens with me where if a tube amplifier leans too far into the realm of tubiness, it loses a little bit of luster for me, because it sounds really cool for like an hour, and then you kind of get used to the sound and everything starts to warp and sound like the tube amplifier itself. Now I think initially amplifiers that do this sound very, very good, but then you realize the limitations of their sound because they always end up sounding like that. They don't sound super dexterous, super diverse in terms of different vocalists. They always kind of seem to lean back into their default sound. This is one of the few tube amplifiers that I feel like has a little bit extra something. It adds a little bit more vibrancy to a vocalist. It adds a little bit more presence to a vocalist. It adds a little bit more isolation to a vocalist, but it doesn't lean so far into always sounding like a WA7. If I would actually define this in a weird way, and this is meant as a total compliment, even though it may not sound like that on the surface, if I'm going to A/B compare this to other amplifiers, I don't think that I would be able to tell you that this was the WA7 sound. I think I would be able to tell you that this is my favorite presentation of the sound so far for vocalists, but I don't know if I'd be able to tell you that it sounds like a WA7, if that makes any sense. With these two examples, it seems to enhance the vocalist in a very unique way that I have not really heard on very many other tube amplifiers. Compare this to something like the TA22, right? That really feature-packed amplifier. That amplifier has a great way of maintaining some solid-state qualities to the sound and adding a little bit of tube qualities to the sound. This is similar in that vein where it doesn't really feel like a compromised tube design besides not making a ton of power. And there is one limitation here with the power, and I was only able to actually test one headphone on this that didn't work, and that was Abyss's flagship headphone, their 1266, which is an extremely demanding headphone. I assume something like an HE6 would probably not work on this, but something like an Aria worked on this just fine. The 109 Pro, of course, the Focal Clear that I just reviewed, which sounds fantastic as a pairing with this. Those all sound amazing, and even though this is only 1.5 watts on paper, in practice, I think that's plenty with this amplifier. Okay, so bass and mid-range are probably the two most important categories to me personally for sound. If those are off, I don't like whatever I'm listening to. So the fact that these affects these in a positive way goes a long way in terms of my personal preference. Other areas that had, I think, totally fair performance for the price tag, though didn't exceed my expectations, were the treble response and the sound staging, and these may even be related categories depending on how you define and break down your treble response. I think that the bass quality was able to drive a room environment that I've talked about a few times in recent videos very well on this amplifier. So if the sound staging is driven by the scale of the sound based off its bass response, something with a lot of room information, big orchestral stuff, this amplifier can sound really wide. But if the sound staging is more driven off the treble response and kind of outside information, I think that the performance here is pretty much on par with other amplifiers in this price tag and other DAC amp combos in this price tag. Doesn't exceed my expectations in a massive way though. I think some other tube amplifiers would be better for sound staging specifically. Even within Woo's own lineup, I will link a couple down below that I think are really good, though they are more expensive. So as far as my conclusion goes, this is something that I think has to be based on a subjective experience and not a technical experience. I think that applies to most tube amplifiers, honestly, so that's not really a surprise here. I think that a lot of people will absolutely love this amplifier. I think a lot of people will have a desire for more features or different input options or different output options that other amplifiers might have. This is a very, very simple hi-fi device, and right away that's going to appeal to certain people, me, and not going to appeal to other people. If I'm a customer looking for more features than this currently has, I'm going to be eyeballing something like an X-Duo TA22. That's got a number of digital outputs that this doesn't have and a number of different analog outputs that this doesn't have, as well as different balanced headphone output options like XLR. But if it's a customer like me, for my personal use, I only use USB. I know that I only use USB, so an amplifier like this is perfectly fine for me. In fact, the limitations are actually an advantage because I know that's what I want. I think though, like most of Woo's products, this is built for a particular customer and not built for other types of customers. And there is, in my opinion, nothing wrong with a product like that. I know for a fact to some people this is not going to be their thing, but I actually quite enjoy this thing, and I'm impressed. I like this thing a lot. So you will find links to this and all of the things I talked about in this video down in the description down below. I'd love to know what you thought about this if you have given it a shot or if you own it. As far as $1,400 amplifiers go, this is actually one of the more popular options that I've seen a lot of people have. So I know that a lot of people are out there rocking it. I'm curious what you guys think about it. What is your experience with this thing? You love it? You hate it? Did it have enough power for you? I'd love to know. All right, thanks a lot for watching. See you guys next time. Bye.